Hi, everybody. Welcome to FriYAYs with Kyla. We have an amazing special guest today, Sara Blanchard. She is a conversationalist, a happiness MC of sorts. She is a TEDx speaker. She is an author, Flex Mom. She is the co-founder of Dear White Women, which we're going to promote. I mean, there's so many things to promote about her, but today we're going to focus on just the podcast, Dear White Women. So welcome, Sara.
Thank you so much for having me, Kyla. This is really fun to talk to you. When you said happiness, like consultant and a facilitator, I was like, is it fitting that I have this on as my shirt today? Because I need a little pick-me-up. So thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's wonderful to hear all the things that I really have been doing recently. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us and your awesome sweater. Loving it. It just makes me happy. It just makes me happy just looking at
it. Some days you just want a little bit of that. No, I'm really excited to talk with you. You and I've always had fascinating conversations since we crossed paths just over a year ago. And we have, crossed paths several times since then. And it's always really thought-provoking and a comfortable place where you can push me to be a little bit uncomfortable. Like you really do challenge my perspectives and help sort of set me on a different course. So I'm really glad to be having this conversation with you.
Awesome. Likewise. So let's get into it.
Okay. So, what do we want to talk about?
Yeah. So tell us about, so you co-founded this Dear White Women podcast with one of your best friends, Sasha. You just launched it. It's been 2 weeks. Tell us the why behind the podcast.
The why is because we want to leave behind a better world for our children. And that sounds really lofty and a little bit cray-cray, but the basic thing is Sasha and I have been best friends ever since it's funny that we're having these conversations now because she and I walked out of a racial identity meeting at Harvard. And that was when we first met. Literally, there was a woman at the Half Asian People's Association meeting saying, Half Asian People's Association, does that mean that we're half a person or are we double a person? And at that point, a few of us stood up and were like, I'm out. This conversation is not the way I process my identity. And so we met right there. And then fast forward, several decades. It's been a long time, but we both have kids and we always talk about how we're very, very different. She and I, we're both half Japanese, half white, but we approach the world totally differently. And it was interesting now that we both have children, the kinds of conversations we're each having with our kids, with our families, and the concerns we have about raising them. She's married to a Black man from the South. And so by sort of American viewpoint, they're Black boys. Whereas I married a white man from Canada and have 2 girls. And so they pretty much pass as white, not as Asian or anything. And the different perspectives that I had to learn because I care about her and her family. The reality is I didn't have to care for the longest time. Being mixed race, Asian and white is very, very different in this country than being mixed race, Black and anything. And so the brutal, honest admission is that I didn't engage in these kind of conversations until it became very personal. But once it did, it was like, she approaches things through history and law. She's a lawyer. And me, like I'm a person who focuses on psychology and thriving and humanity and connection. And so the why is that there's so many different perspectives to be shared and to grow and learn together that it was like, well, we're doing these conversations anyway. If we can continue moving the needle a little bit about identity and wellness for more people in our country, we would like to just do our part.
That's awesome. I love the legacy part of wanting to leave something behind for your daughters and for her kids, Sasha's kids, and the admission part of your the vulnerability of your own admission.
Yeah. Well, and it's partly, we're both in positive psychology wellness world, so I don't want to go too scary, but the reality is it's freaking scary right now. The statistics for suicide and homicide in this country for the young people, it's like, we just want them to make it to adulthood and be healthy and happy, the best we can. And what better way to engage than to have conversations? I mean, right? At versus with, having conversations with people, it's a way of being and engaging with people to open their minds to the perspective and the possibility that maybe the world isn't the way you see it for everybody.
Yeah, no, it's so powerful. And I think something that I've been appreciating about you and the people that I try to surround myself with is walking the talk. So
Integrity, right?
I love that you're walking the talk and creating change around something that can be seemingly challenging. So I'm curious, what have you learned about yourself in the process
of the podcast? That I am absolutely a product of a society that. So I've read the book White Fragility, and in it positions racism as an institution. It's not that I am a racist per se, but rather that I grew up in a system that does tier white, males basically up here, and that there are systems that were created to support the thriving of white males in this country, and to be able to look at my own bias, to have real conversations about and looking at the history. I'm not traditionally not as much into history and dates of things, and but it's giving me a reason to learn some of these things, and now these facts are sticking in my head so much better, that I realized engaging with stuff when you really care about it, for me, it leads me to have a better memory, which is great, hopefully, for the things that matter to me. What other stuff have I learned? I've learned also that sometimes you just got to do it. You got to just go out and do the things. You and I talked about it before, right? But I was like, are we really doing this? Like, we're calling it the Dear White Women podcast? Like, that's kind of provocative. Are we going to do this? And I think in the past, even with my book, which was a book that's out there, but I wasn't super stoked. I kind of did the whole write a book and hide. I didn't promote it. I didn't talk about it. I was kind of like, And I think I've learned through the process of the more I do stuff with that integrity in mind, what you were just talking about, with truly, like, my intention is not anything other than I really want to have these conversations and engage people and move the needle. It's not for ulterior motives. I operate really well in that field. And so this time, with this freedom to show up and do what we do, I'm feeling more comfortable getting out and talking to people about it and promoting it and really being like, yeah, we're really doing this. It's out. It's done. We are in process and in motion, and it feels really good.
I love that. That's awesome. It sounds like there's so much alignment with, your values and who you are and what you want to do and who you want to be in the world. And what an inspiration for your daughters to see that alignment on
it's not
so
to
many
say
levels.
it's not, thank you. It's not to say it's not scary and terrifying. I mean, to be honest, today we recorded an episode on the history of hate and the KKK. And as my mouth was moving as we were talking, I was like, that could be really scary. I mean, we were talking about the history of it, but we're putting ourselves out there a little bit. And I want us to stay safe. It is so easy to stay safe. And yet you don't make change by not going through a little bit of discomfort. I sort of joked in a previous episode once, like, the same way you go to the gym and you work out, it's a little bit uncomfortable to push your body, but you don't grow, you don't get stronger without that. And I feel like this is that parallel. It is a little uncomfortable. And maybe you just got to do your body compass check in with, is that risk worth it? Is that discomfort worth it in the greater scheme of things? So,
yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think about. So have you watched Brene Brown's Netflix special?
It's so on my, I just haven't sat down in the evenings to do that. But I have been very excited to watch it, and everybody's telling me I need to watch it. So I'm very looking forward to it. But tell me what.
Yeah. So one of the things that she says, and I totally thought of you when she said this, was, so she talked about, Black Lives Matter and like Me Too and, all these movements that are, it's an exciting time, right? I mean, we are in a time where there's division and there's strife. And as you mentioned, in terms of well-being and mental health, we are at a very tense point. At the same time, it's kind of created, a lot of this other movement.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so she talks about how, we need to have uncomfortable conversations.
Yes.
But I know, so awesome. But then she also said this idea of the conversation being uncomfortable is based out of like privilege, like white privilege.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yep.
And I was like, what? So I was wondering if you could speak more to that.
I think the idea of it, and it was exemplified. I did this event. I live in a predominantly white community still. And there are Black children in all the schools. And I, last year, started having conversations around race in our community. And I was approached mid-year by some parents being like, my kids are being called the N-word at school, in elementary school. It is not acceptable. It is done by white students. Can you please help us gather a bunch of parents together and tell them that it's not acceptable to use the N-word, like that they need to have these explicit conversations with their children, that, they need to understand a little bit about what it's like to walk through life in our shoes, kind of thing. It was I was so appreciative of the panelists who trusted the opportunity and trusted me and trusted each other to open up about their experiences walking through the United States as Black individuals or raising Black children or, mixed race and all the things. And what came up there was that they don't have a choice. When their kid is 7 being called the N-word, they're talking about race. They're talking about the history of what the N-word actually means, what it stands for, where it came from. They're talking about, why are people touching my hair without asking me? They're talking about, why do I have to be careful with the police? It's not a choice, it's survival. And it's something that is done upon minorities a lot in this country. And so white people who identify as white typically don't think that they need to talk about it explicitly. But the reality is kids don't absorb by osmosis what your view is. Just because you said hi to the Black cashier at the store does not mean they think that you believe as parents that we should all be even, and including people of all different walks of life. And so because that just goes into this idea of the racial construct where everything is created through this lens of whiteness. And so people who identify as white don't even see themselves as white. Does that make sense? Sort of like you check white on the census box, but it's not like it's a discomfort to address something that has previously been unseen. But it's sort of like capitalism or this idea of meritocracy, or none of these systems, until you name them, you kind of don't realize, I'm chasing the money, until you're like, oh, but we're very capitalistic in our society. And so that's what the value has been placed on. And as soon as you identify it, you can be like, oh, right. Okay. In that same way, by just simply acknowledging that there is such a thing as race, that there are historic structures in place. And that's why white people don't often have to talk about race. That's what that is about, in my opinion, my understanding of it.
I love this. And so everything leads back to happiness, of course. And that's how we met and how we girl crushed it. So tell us the link to happiness. Could you share more about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've talked about and that I really believe in firmly is that Harvard Grant study, when they showed that the biggest predictor of your long-term health and happiness is the quality of your close relationships, right? We need to be connected. People need to have a sense of purpose and belonging too, in order to thrive as a human being. And when you're constantly being ostracized, when you're only insulated, it's easy to be in insulated groups and just go through life and feel like you belong, but that's not always the way of the world. And certainly for minorities, that's not. And so when you are complicit in a system that doesn't bring in minorities, that truly integrates, little things like Black people into your book club or Asian people into your book club, if it's a predominantly white book club, consciously making the choices to step out of your comfort zone and incorporate the rich tapestry of experiences we all have in this country without offering that sense of belonging, you create this like disparity, right? You have the huge wealth gap that's happening. You'll have a huge happiness gap. And I don't believe, I don't know how a country can have such a widening gap and not start all sinking, right? It's like the opposite. I mean, I feel like on the flip side, we rise by lifting others, a rising tide lifts all ships. Like, I feel like that is how we are happier. And the World Happiness Report that just came out, the top of the list were these countries that had that we culture, that had safety nets in place. So if you get hit by a car, you're not going to have to lose your house. If that you can get some education, that you can, like, they look out for one another. And those are the cultures that are happiest. And then tying back to, if you're happier, then you're more successful. We could be more successful as a country. So I think it's up to every one of us to look around at the realities we create and see if we truly are feeling, first of all, happier ourselves and feeling like we have a place of belonging and a sense of purpose, but then reaching out to people who may not live the same life that we do and make sure people are okay around us too.
Love that. So beautiful. And I just was actually in Finland for the end of my book tour, and
so cool.
You can feel that, you can, it's very palpable. That, there's no homeless people on the streets of Helsinki.
That's interesting.
Finnish people are very much in nature. There's like almost 180,000 lakes. There's 15,000 trees per person. There's a big sauna culture. And they're really in tune with nature. There isn't a sense of gap, between nature, between money, between classes. Finnish people don't go out to dinner; they eat at home.
Yeah, it's different. Like, each culture is going to be different in that regard. I know that at the World Happiness Summit this last year, Robert B. Swastina Diener did a whole talk on hospitality. Mm. And the reality is, in some cultures, Korea is probably the same. Japan, that I'm familiar with, is the same. You don't have homes. Homes are built to sleep and have your nuclear family, but you do all the entertaining and connecting outside through, whether it's sheer size and availability of real estate, because you have so many people crammed in such small places. Mm-hmm. In those areas, I do wonder, how do you create a sense of community and purpose and connection when you don't have the open your doors? I mean, I'm a big fan of opening doors and having, hosting and connecting and that sort of stuff. I don't know how that plays out in other cultures. And so that's where I'm not sure that that's always the answer for everybody. Each culture is different. But yeah, I think all of that it's fascinating. You observed all that and you felt all of that in Finland.
I mean, it's so amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And to make our shows as with as possible, it's now your turn to ask me any questions you may have.
Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. What has been the most exciting part for you about stepping into this next stage of your growth?
Yeah, I love that. There's so much. I mean, I think something that I realized, and it's probably taken me 40 years. I was just telling a friend of mine last night, I spent so much of my life in either avoidance or survival mode and not in growth. So we talked a little bit about this before we went live, but just doing the thing that helps you be in growth all the time, whether that's, going to a talk on microaggression, whether that's, creating a podcast, what you've done, whether that's, for me, hosting a retreat. I mean, rather than worry about the fear of there's always going to be fear, like you said, about your stuff, right? It's really scary. It doesn't mean that it's not scary. But something that I've learned, have you heard about self-distancing and self-transcendence?
No, but that sounds fancy and interesting.
Okay. So, I'm so excited to share. You're going to love it. So something that I just happened upon in one of those Psychology Today magazines is, a lot of us are self-doubters, and I'm definitely included in this. So we self-doubt for whatever reason. I I've always been a I'm not good enougher. So
I have on the wall right over here the phrase "I am enough." So I get that. I understand.
yeah, I do too. I do too. I remember seeing it at your house and be like, that's my favorite.
Yes.
um, so there's two things that we can do, and I'm sure you've done them, and you are doing this, just without the label. One thing is self-distancing, where you watch your movie, your life movie, and you're not in the emotional vortex of this happened to me. I'm gonna be in this and react with emotion. And so the self-transcendence piece is having this greater purpose, right? Being part of a larger story. Well, if, for example, for you, right? Like if I create this podcast and there's another, half Asian, half white, younger version of yourself, and even your daughters, right? In the future, they're out there and they're like, they see that and they can see what is possible for them. You created a change in the narrative. And for you, for your podcast, like there's so many layers, right? Because you're literally like, dear white women. But for me, like the way I see it is, similarly, like with my book, I had so much fear around putting it out and getting rejected and nobody's going to read it, all that kind of negative self-talk and self-doubt. But then realizing, and this has actually happened a couple times too, right? People coming up to me and being like, somebody, I heard somebody read your book or I read your book and, changed this particular part of my life or whatever, but also realizing what's possible for them, because most of the self-help books that I had seen or that I had read were people who didn't look like me. And I couldn't identify with them. So I created something that I wish I had been able to read as a 20-something, kind of, and even now, I'm like, I'm doing I was inspired because you did your own audiobook.
Yes. Yep.
So I've been doing my own audiobook and and like reading some of it. I'm like, oh yeah, I need to work on that. Like that, like yep. that's like a work in progress, So
I like that though, that sense of what you're talking about is creating opportunities for people to belong. Even if it's not necessarily, I mean, yes, of course, there's the message for you with the with versus at philosophy and way of living, for sure. And being like, look, this is my professor. There's an Asian woman. This is a person who looks like me who's doing the things. And I think that's the feedback I keep getting with Flex Mom. I mean, every week I get more people emailing me where I have put that book like in my past, but I still get emails from people being like, you're talking about me. Like, this is my life. I belong. Like, this is amazing. And it feels so...
That's so awesome.
Like, cool. We've got a tribe. Like, you can create things and there are people out there. You don't have to worry about competition or for, all the things, the negative stuff, as you said. I like that.
Yeah. And it just made me think, like what you just said, just made me think of this Forbes article that dispels the myth about how, what we used to think about women, right? That they kind of go like this to each other to get to the top because there's so few positions at the top. But what they found was women who support other women are actually more successful.
It's amazing, right? I love that.
Yeah. And just sitting on this panel. So I was at this like women's leadership summit thingy, and there's like a woman from Ghana.
Yeah, I love how you're like downplaying it. This International Women's Leadership Summit, rock stars. Yes.
Thank you. I accept your compliment, which I'm also working on and working with women on doing. But so there's a woman from Ghana, like literally she had just flown in from Ghana. There was a woman from Mumbai. There was like a Korean woman who was the moderator. And then there was like a Korean American woman and me. And I just thought, imagine so like on a micro level, right, we're having these amazing conversations and there's so much diversity in perspective, right? Like going back to what you're saying, creating that belonging, you know, that women, we belong here. We belong on this stage. And we belong in diversity and you know, we know all the data, right? You know all the data about like diverse teams outperform homogenous ones in corporations, and we persist. You know, this is what you speak to, right? We persist in getting, you know, did you hear how there was like that recent company that was like, we're looking for a Caucasian male?
Yes. And they were like, oops, we didn't mean to put that out there.
I mean, 2019. What?
But here's the scary thing. We just, in this episode that we just researched, and this is what I'm a little concerned about, is every time the KKK, there have been several generations of KKK, for example, hate groups, there are 50% increase in hate groups in the United States in 2018. When your position of power or privilege is threatened, one of the things that happen is you get fearful, right? Like say anybody, any superstar, and all of a sudden the next young hottest model comes through, you feel threatened. It's a human condition, right? Like you've achieved so much, and how can I continue to achieve? And it's that sense of lack and competition, right? So what is happening now is you're having all the, and every time the KKK came around, it was usually after a wave of immigration. After World War II, and then also there was World War I, World War II, and then it really started again after slavery was abolished. So when there's this movement and this, and I'm like, so when you're talking about, yes, it's 2019, but the human condition doesn't necessarily change unless you really have these kind of like aha epiphanies within yourself that you're like, oh, let me identify that sense of fear and realize I don't, like, it's a lot of inner work. And then if you hang with people who don't do that inner work and you want to belong, you're going to hang out with them and create your group. This KKK was started by 6 people who just met. It was not like a big, like, it doesn't take a large group to make a huge impact. It doesn't have to start there. So I guess going to your, you know, I guess what I was just saying is that it's 2019. Have we come that far in human development though, is my question. I don't know. And I don't mean to, again, sound doomsday, but I think that's where each one of us has to look in the mirror and be like, what's my role to play in this? How do I want to show up? Because if ugly hate rears its head, as it continues to do, certainly in the United States, where a lot of angry, unhappy people, it's really scary. It can affect, there's a lot of collateral damage that can happen.
Yeah, no, there's so much there. There's so much to unpack. But I love
sorry,
how,
that was a little bit
no,
heavy.
don't apologize. Don't apologize. I love how you're addressing all of that, you know, in your podcast. I mean, you're the change, you're being the change, and you're living the change. And it's such a inspiration for people who don't know where to start.
And so are you. You are being a role model as an Asian woman, right? Traveling the world, where so many people sit there and think of it as a small place or within your city or your state, or maybe you can travel the country, but you are making a difference and connecting bits and pieces of different areas of the world. The fact that you can now bring into your experience and viscerally, like from a, you know, bodily perspective, based on your time in Finland, for example, like that's huge. You can offer that perspective and the commonality and the differences of observation about how things work, and share that with your audience as you continue to grow and do things. I mean, I think it's incredible.
Thank you so much. You're so amazing. It's been so wonderful and inspiring to have you. And we have the link to the Dear White Women podcast below. And please reach out to Sara if you are interested in like a topic or you don't see it on the Dear White Women podcast. She'd love to hear from you, right?
Totally. Absolutely. No, we'd love to hear. We're going to just launch a bit of a private community, but the podcast comes out every Wednesday, America time, right? And we're excited to have you join the conversation.
Yay! Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Kyla. It was really fun to talk with you.
And happy FriYAY, everybody. Bye for now.